The train wheezed to a stop at Millbrook Valley's modest depot, steam hissing from its iron belly like the dying breath of some great beast. Emma Harrison clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, feeling the weight of everything she owned pressing against her ribs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, carefully hidden beneath layers of blankets in a makeshift basket, two tiny hearts beat in perfect rhythm with her own thundering pulse. Lucy and Sam, just 3 months old, slept peacefully, unaware that their mother was about to step into a life built on a foundation of desperate hope and carefully guarded secrets. Through the smudged window, Emma caught her first glimpse of the man who had answered her letter. James Mitchell stood apart from the small crowd gathered at the platform, his broad shoulders cutting a solitary figure against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. Even from a distance, she could see the uncertainty in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 32 or 33, with dark hair that caught the late afternoon sun and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with something between nervousness and anticipation. What struck her most was not his rugged handsomeness, though he certainly possessed that in abundance, but the careful way he positioned himself. He faced the train directly, his gaze fixed and unwavering, as if he needed to read the world through. Sight alone. Emma's heart squeezed as understanding dawned. The brief mention in his letter about preferring written correspondence suddenly made perfect sense. James Mitchell was deaf, and in this moment, watching him scan the emerging passengers with such focused attention, she realized he was probably as nervous about this meeting as she was. The other townspeople gave him a wide berth, their glances ranging from polite indifference to barely concealed pity. Emma noticed how they clustered together, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes occasionally flicking toward James with the kind of careful distance people maintained around things. They didn't understand. It was a look she knew well, the same expression she had endured in Chicago after her husband's death, when neighbors had begun to whisper about the young widow who rarely left her boarding house room and seemed to be hiding something. Emma stepped down from the train car, her legs unsteady after the long journey from Chicago. The mountain air hit her lungs like a slap of pure ice, so different from the thick, smoky atmosphere of the city she had left behind. She adjusted her grip on the basket, praying the twins would remain asleep just a little longer. The deception she was about to perpetrate weighed on her conscience like a stone, but desperation had a way of making even the most honest person capable of extraordinary lies. Her correspondence with James had been brief and practical. A widowed cattle rancher seeking a wife for companionship and help managing his household. A widow seeking security and a fresh start, far from the judgmental eyes of her former neighbors. Neither had been entirely truthful, but then again, most mail-order arrangements were built on carefully curated versions of the truth. James had not mentioned his deafness, and Emma had certainly not mentioned the 2 infants she was smuggling into their arrangement like contraband. As she walked toward him, Emma studied James more closely. His clothes were well made but practical, the kind worn by a man who valued function over fashion. His boots were polished but showed the scuff marks of actual work, and his hands, when he removed his hat in greeting, bore the calluses and small scars of someone who labored with purpose. When their eyes met, she saw intelligence there, and something else that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. Kindness. It was a quality that had been notably absent from most of the men she had encountered since becoming a widow. James approached her with measured steps, his movements deliberate and confident, despite the obvious uncertainty of the moment. When he was close enough to read her lips, he spoke, his voice carrying the slight, unusual cadence of someone who could not hear his own words, but had learned to speak through memory and determination. "Mrs. Harrison," His voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by years of shouting commands across vast pasture lands to workers who might not realize he could not hear their responses. "I'm James Mitchell. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Emma nodded, shifting the basket slightly to keep it behind her skirts. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for meeting me. The journey was long, but I'm grateful to be here." She spoke clearly, facing him directly, instinctively understanding that he needed to see her mouth to follow her words. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps at her natural accommodation of his needs. Most people, she suspected, either shouted at him as if volume could overcome his deafness, or avoided speaking to him altogether. The small gesture seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders. "I have a wagon waiting," he said, gesturing toward a sturdy vehicle hitched to two well-groomed horses. "The ranch is about 5 miles out of town. I thought you might want to see your new home before dark." As they walked toward the wagon, Emma became acutely aware of the stares following them. A small group of well-dressed women stood near the depot's entrance, their whispered conversation dying as Emma passed. She caught fragments of their assessment, words like "city clothes" and "too young" and "what's in that basket?" The last comment made her grip tighten involuntarily. James must have noticed the women's attention as well, because he positioned himself slightly between Emma and the group, a protective gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. He helped her into the wagon with careful courtesy, his touch brief but steady. As he loaded her single trunk into the back, Emma marveled at how someone could be so considerate while carrying himself with such quiet strength. The drive through Millbrook Valley revealed a community perched on the edge of wilderness, where civilization maintained only a tenuous hold against the vast, untamed landscape. The main street was a collection of practical buildings clustered around basic necessities: a general store, a bank, a small church, and a saloon that looked like it had seen better days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gardens and small farms dotted the outskirts, but beyond them the land opened into rolling pastures that stretched toward mountains so tall they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. James handled the horses with an ease that spoke of years, of experience, guiding them along a well-worn road that climbed gradually into the foothills. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his explanations brief but informative. The old mine shaft where his father had once worked before buying his first cattle. The creek that provided water for the ranch and never ran dry, even in the worst drought years. The stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn and could be seen from the ranch house windows. Emma found herself studying his profile as he spoke, noting the concentration in his expression as he watched her face for signs of understanding or interest. There was something deeply attractive about his focus, the way he gave his complete attention to whatever task was at hand. In Chicago, she had grown accustomed to men who looked through her or past her, who saw only what they wanted to see. James looked at her as if she mattered, as if her thoughts and reactions were worth his consideration. The twins stirred in their basket, and Emma's heart jumped into her throat. She coughed loudly, hoping to mask any small sounds they might make. James glanced at her with concern, and she managed a weak smile. "Just the mountain air," she said. "It's much thinner than what I'm used to." He nodded, understanding, but she caught him looking at the basket with curious eyes. The deception was already beginning to fray at the edges, and they hadn't even reached the ranch yet. As they crested a small hill, the Mitchell ranch spread out before them like something from a dream Emma had never dared to have. The main house was larger than she had expected, built from local stone and timber that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and comfort. Outbuildings dotted the property with purposeful efficiency. Barns, a bunkhouse, corrals where horses moved like liquid shadow in the fading light. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, dark shapes scattered across pastures that rolled toward the mountains like a green sea. "It's beautiful," Emma said, and meant it. After months in cramped Chicago boarding houses, the sheer space and openness of the ranch felt like a revelation. James's face brightened with genuine pleasure at her reaction. "My father started this place with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. I've been trying to honor what he built while making it something of my own." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I hope you'll come to think of it as home." Home. The word hung between them, weighted with possibilities and expectations. Neither of them was quite ready to examine. Emma had not had a real home since her husband's death, had not felt truly safe anywhere in so long that she had almost forgotten what security felt like. Looking at the ranch house with its welcoming windows and the man beside her with his careful kindness, she felt the first stirring of something that might eventually grow into hope. As they approached the house, several ranch hands emerged from the barn to help with her luggage. James introduced them with obvious respect for their skills and contributions. Miguel, the head wrangler, who had worked for James's father and knew more about horses than anyone in 3 counties. Ben, barely 18, but already showing the steady competence that marked a good cattleman. Tom, grizzled and weathered, who served as both cook and general problem solver for the crew. Each man greeted Emma with polite courtesy, but she noticed how they communicated with James through a combination of gestures, written notes, and exaggerated lip movements that suggested years of developing their own system of understanding. It was clear that James's deafness was simply accepted here as part of who he was, not a limitation to be pitied or overcome, but a characteristic to be accommodated naturally, like left-handedness or a preference for coffee over tea. Inside, the house revealed itself to be as thoughtfully arranged as everything else about James Mitchell. The furniture was solid and well-made, chosen for comfort rather than fashion. Books lined shelves in the main room, suggesting a man who valued learning and quiet entertainment. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a large table that spoke of meals shared in companionship. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was a loneliness to the space that Emma recognized, the particular emptiness that settled into a home when only one person moved through its rooms day after day. James showed her to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, carrying her trunk with easy strength. The room was simple but comfortable, with a large window that looked out over the pastures toward the mountains. A small writing desk sat in one corner, and Emma realized he had placed it there, specifically for her, remembering her mention in one of her letters that she enjoyed correspondence. "I thought you might like to write to friends back in Chicago," he said, setting her trunk down carefully. "Let them know you arrived safely." Emma nodded, though the truth was, there was no one left in Chicago who would worry about her welfare. The friends she had made as a married woman had drifted away after her husband's death, uncomfortable with her changed circumstances. Her family had made their disapproval clear when she refused their suggestions for how she should conduct her widowhood. The isolation had been one of the driving forces behind her decision to answer James's advertisement, though she had not mentioned that particular motivation in her letters. "Thank you," she said. "That's very thoughtful." As evening settled over the ranch, Emma found herself in the strange position of being both guest and future wife, uncertain of her role or expectations. James seemed to sense her confusion and maintained a careful distance, treating her with the courtesy he might show any visitor while leaving space for them both to adjust to this new arrangement. They shared a simple dinner prepared by Tom, who proved to be as skilled in the kitchen as he was with cattle. The conversation was careful and polite, covering safe topics like the weather, the ranch operations, and Emma's impressions of Colorado territory. James was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions and responding to her answers with the kind of focused attention that made her feel heard in a way she had not experienced in years. But underneath the pleasant surface conversation, Emma felt the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs like a physical thing. Upstairs in her room, hidden beneath layers of blankets, Lucy and Sam waited for her return. She had managed to feed them before dinner, slipping away under the pretense of changing clothes, but she knew she could not maintain this deception much longer. Infants had needs that could not be scheduled around adult convenience, and it was only a matter of time before their presence was discovered. As the evening wound down, James showed her the rest of the house, including his study, where he conducted the ranch's business correspondence. The room was filled with carefully organized papers, ledgers that tracked cattle sales and expenses, and maps of the surrounding territory, marked with notes about grazing areas and water sources. It was the workspace of a man who ran his operation, with intelligence and attention to detail, despite whatever challenges his deafness might present. "I do most of my business through written correspondence," he explained, gesturing to a stack of letters on his desk. "It's more reliable than trying to conduct negotiations I might mishear or misunderstand." Emma nodded, but her attention was caught by something else entirely. On a shelf behind his desk, she spotted a small collection of children's books, their bindings worn from handling. When she looked at them with obvious curiosity, James followed her gaze, and his expression grew slightly embarrassed. "I taught school for a few years before I inherited the ranch," he said. "I always thought I might have children someday who would enjoy those stories." The simple honesty of the statement hit Emma like a physical blow. Here was a man who had planned for a family, who had saved children's books in hope of someday reading them to sons and daughters. And she was bringing him exactly that, but wrapped in deception and presented as something they were not. Standing in his study, surrounded by evidence of his thoughtfulness and planning, Emma felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She was not just hiding her children from him, she was denying him the chance to know about them, to choose whether he wanted to be their stepfather, to decide if he was prepared for the reality of instant parenthood rather than the gradual building of a family he had clearly envisioned. But she was also terrified. Terrified that if she told him the truth, he would send her away. Terrified that she would find herself alone again, with 2 infants depending on her and nowhere to go. The practical realities of her situation had driven her to this deception. But standing in James's study, seeing the evidence of his character and kindness, she began to understand that the lie was not just unfair to him, it was unworthy of what he was offering her. That night, as Emma finally returned to her room and gathered Lucy and Sam into her arms for their evening feeding, she whispered promises to them in the darkness. Promises that somehow, some way, she would find the courage to tell James the truth. Promises that she would find a way to make this work, to build the family they all needed, even if it meant risking everything she had gained by coming to Millbrook Valley. Outside her window, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, but Emma could see lights still burning in the bunkhouse, where the hands were probably playing cards or sharing stories from the day's work. Somewhere in the house below, James was probably reading or working on ranch business, unaware that his carefully ordered life was about to be transformed by the arrival of 2 small people who would change everything he thought he knew about his future. As she held her sleeping children, Emma made a decision. She would give herself a few days to understand this place and this man better, to see if the kindness she had glimpsed was real and lasting. And then, somehow, she would find the words to tell James Mitchell that his mail-order bride had brought him not just herself, but the beginning of the family he had dreamed of having. Whether he would see it as a gift or a betrayal remained to be discovered, but Emma was beginning to understand that this man deserved her honesty, whatever the cost to her own security. The mountain night settled around the ranch house like a protective embrace, full of possibilities and dangers Emma could not yet imagine. But for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something that might eventually grow into hope, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. Dawn crept across the valley like spilled honey, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that Emma had never witnessed from her Chicago boarding house window. She stood at her bedroom window, Lucy cradled against her shoulder, while Sam slept peacefully in the makeshift cradle she had fashioned from her trunk and some blankets. The twins had woken twice during the night, and each time Emma had held her breath, certain their soft cries would echo through the house and expose her carefully guarded secret. Below in the yard, she could see James moving among the horses. In the corral, his movements fluid and confident as he checked each animal with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his livelihood depended on the health and strength of his stock. Even from a distance, she could observe the careful way he positioned himself to see the horses' reactions, relying on visual cues where others might depend on sound. There was something deeply attractive about his competence, the way he had adapted his methods without compromising his effectiveness. Emma had barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of her deception and the growing certainty that James Mitchell was exactly the kind of man who deserved honesty from the beginning. She had observed him throughout the previous evening, noting how he treated his workers with respect, how he had anticipated her needs without being asked, how he had shared his hopes for the future with touching vulnerability. The children's books on his shelf haunted her thoughts, tangible evidence of dreams that aligned perfectly with what she was hiding from him. A soft knock at her door sent panic shooting through her veins. Emma quickly placed Lucy in the trunk beside her brother and arranged the blankets to muffle any sounds they might make. She smoothed her hair and opened the door to find James standing in the hallway, fully dressed and carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might appreciate something warm," he said, offering her the cup with a small smile. "The mornings can be brutal up here until you adjust to the altitude." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic and using the moment to compose herself. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful. I was just admiring the view. It's nothing like Chicago." James nodded, glancing past her toward the window. "I never get tired of watching the sun come up over the mountains. It's different every morning, depending on the weather and the season." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I was wondering if you might like to see more of the ranch today. I could show you the operations, introduce you to the cattle, let you get a feel for what life is like here." The offer was clearly genuine, and Emma found herself genuinely wanting to accept, but the logistics of leaving the twins alone for an extended period made her stomach clench with anxiety. "That sounds wonderful," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps after I've had some time to settle in a bit more." Something flickered across James's expression, a momentary shadow that might have been disappointment or confusion, but he nodded politely. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Tom's preparing breakfast if you're hungry." After he left, Emma sank onto the bed, coffee growing cold in her hands, as she confronted the impossible mathematics of her situation. She could not leave the twins alone for extended periods, but she also could not explain their presence without revealing the depth of her deception. Every hour that passed made the eventual revelation more difficult, the betrayal more profound. She managed to feed the twins and slipped downstairs for a brief breakfast with James, making excuses about fatigue from travel when he suggested they walk around the immediate grounds. His politeness never wavered, but she could sense his puzzlement at her reluctance to engage with ranch life. This was not the eager, fresh start he had probably expected from his mail-order bride. The day passed in a series of small deceptions and careful orchestrations. Emma claimed headaches when James suggested activities that would take her away from the house for too long. She invented correspondence that needed immediate attention when he offered to introduce her to neighboring ranches. Each lie felt heavier than the last, but the alternative, potential rejection and homelessness with 2 infants, seemed impossible to risk. By afternoon, the twins were growing restless from being confined to the trunk for extended periods, and Emma knew she needed to find a better solution. While James was occupied with ranch business, she explored the house more thoroughly, searching for a place where the children could be more comfortable without being discovered. The house proved to be thoughtfully designed, with several rooms that James clearly did not use regularly. One, a small chamber off the main hallway that might once have been intended as a nursery, contained only a few pieces of unused furniture and had windows that faced away from the main yard. Emma realized she could establish a more permanent hiding place there, somewhere the twins could sleep and play without the risk of being overheard from the commonly used areas of the house. That evening, as James worked on ranch accounts in his study, Emma carefully moved the twins to their new location. She had fashioned a proper cradle from blankets and pillows, and the room was warm enough to keep them comfortable. For the first time since arriving, she felt she could breathe without the constant fear of immediate discovery. Her relief was short-lived. As she prepared to return to the main part of the house, she heard voices from the front porch. Through the window, she could see James speaking with a woman Emma did not recognize. Their conversation animated and clearly important. The woman was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and clothes that spoke of prosperity and social position. Even without hearing their words, Emma could read the tension in James's posture, the defensive set of his shoulders as the woman gestured emphatically. When Emma finally joined them, James introduced his visitor as Mrs. Margaret Sterling, wife of the local banker, and it quickly became apparent one of Millbrook Valley's self-appointed moral guardians. "Mrs. Harrison," Margaret Sterling said, her smile bright and sharp as polished steel. "How wonderful to finally meet James's mail-order bride. We've all been so curious about the woman who would be brave enough to venture into our remote little community." The words were perfectly polite, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Emma was an outsider, a disruption to the established order, someone who would need to prove herself worthy of acceptance. "Mrs. Sterling," Emma replied, matching the woman's formal tone, "thank you for the welcome. The valley is beautiful and everyone has been very kind." Margaret's eyes swept over Emma with obvious assessment, taking in her city-made dress, her pale complexion, her soft hands that had never known hard physical labor. "I'm sure it must be quite an adjustment from Chicago. We lead simple lives here, very different from the sophistication of the city." James stepped slightly closer to Emma, a subtle but clear gesture of support. "Emma will find her place here," he said quietly, "just as everyone does when they're willing to work and contribute." The words carried weight, and Margaret's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging the gentle rebuke, but her smile never wavered. "Of course, I'm sure she will, though I confess I'm curious about that large basket you carried from the train. Martha Cooper mentioned it seemed quite heavy for personal belongings." Emma's heart stopped. The basket had been her method of transporting the twins from the train, and she had hoped its brief appearance would be quickly forgotten. Now it seemed the entire town had been discussing her arrival with the kind of detailed attention that made secrets impossible to maintain. "Just some books and keepsakes from home," Emma managed to say. "Things with sentimental value that I couldn't bear to leave behind." Margaret nodded, but her eyes remained sharp and curious. "How lovely. I do hope you'll be happy here, Mrs. Harrison. Small communities can be wonderfully supportive, but they do require a certain Transparency. We all depend on each other. You understand, and secrets have a way of creating unnecessary complications. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Emma felt James's attention focus on her with new intensity, and she realized that Margaret Sterling's visit had been carefully calculated to plant seeds of suspicion and doubt. After the woman left, James walked with Emma toward the corral, his expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. The evening air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Margaret Sterling is not a bad woman, James said carefully, but she has strong opinions about how people should conduct themselves. She was probably trying to warn you that the community will be watching to see what kind of person you are. Emma nodded, understanding the implication. And what kind of person do you think I am, James? He stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes serious in the gathering dusk. I think you're someone who has been hurt and is being very careful about trusting again. I think you're stronger than you know and more frightened than you want to admit. He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. I also think you're keeping something from me, and I'm hoping that when you're ready, you'll trust me enough to share whatever it is. The gentle directness of his observation hit Emma like a physical blow. Here was her chance, the opening she had been both hoping for and dreading. She could tell him about the twins right now, in this moment when his words suggested he might. Be prepared to understand and accept whatever she revealed. But fear paralyzed her tongue. Fear of rejection, fear of homelessness, fear of disappointing this good man who had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. I'm sorry if I seem distant, she said instead, the words feeling like ashes in her mouth. It's just a big change, coming to a new place, starting a new life. I suppose I need more time to adjust than I thought. James nodded slowly, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes, the recognition that she had chosen to maintain her barriers rather than accept his invitation to honesty. The next morning brought new complications. Emma woke to find Lucy running a slight fever, her tiny face flushed and her breathing slightly labored. Panic flooded through her as she realized the baby might need medical attention. But how could she explain the presence of a sick infant she had never mentioned? She spent the morning trying to treat Lucy's symptoms with the limited supplies she had brought, using techniques she had learned from her mother and from necessity during her months of solo mothering in Chicago. But as the day progressed, Lucy's condition did not improve, and Emma found herself facing an impossible choice between her child's health and her secret. James noticed her distracted behavior during their brief interactions, the way she kept glancing toward the stairs, the tension that seemed to radiate from her with increasing intensity. When he suggested they take a walk together after lunch, Emma's refusal was sharp enough to surprise them both. I'm sorry, she said quickly, seeing the hurt flash across his features. I'm not feeling well myself. Perhaps another time. But James was not fooled by her excuses, and Emma could see suspicion beginning to replace confusion in his expressions. The careful distance he had maintained was starting to feel less like courtesy and more like the wariness of a man who was beginning to question what he had gotten himself into. That afternoon, while James was occupied with ranch work, Emma made a desperate decision. She wrapped Lucy carefully in blankets and made her way to the small chamber she had been using as a nursery, intending to check on both twins and assess whether Lucy's condition required medical intervention she could not provide. She was so focused on her sick child that she failed to notice the sound of boots on the front porch, failed to hear the door open and close as James returned to the house earlier than expected. She was singing softly to Lucy, trying to comfort the feverish infant when she heard a sharp intake of breath behind her. Emma turned to find James standing in the doorway of the small room, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. His eyes moved from her face to the baby in her arms to the makeshift nursery she had created, taking in the evidence of deception that had been hiding under his own roof. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma clutched Lucy closer, her heart hammering so hard she was certain James could hear it across the room. Sam stirred in his cradle, making small baby sounds that filled the silence with their innocent presence. James stepped into the room slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. His eyes never left Emma's face as he approached, and she could see him processing the implications of what he was witnessing, understanding filtering through shock as he realized the depth of what she had concealed from him. "How long?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but strained. Emma's throat felt like it was closing. "They're mine," she whispered. "My children, Lucy and Sam. They're 3 months old." James nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the babies with an expression Emma could not read. "I gathered that much. What I'm asking is how long you've been hiding them from me, since you arrived." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the conversations they had shared, all the careful lies Emma had told, all the opportunities for honesty she had let slip away. "Yes," Emma said, the word barely audible. James was quiet for a long time, studying the babies with an intensity that made Emma's stomach churn with anxiety. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undertone of hurt that cut through her more effectively than anger would have. "I see," he said simply. "And their father?" "Dead," Emma replied, her voice gaining strength from the truth of it. "He died in an industrial accident 4 months ago, before they were born." James absorbed this information with a slight nod, his expression remaining carefully neutral. Emma could not tell what he was thinking, could not read whether he was preparing to order her to leave or simply trying to understand the situation he found himself in. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why hide them? Why not tell me in your letters, or when you arrived, or at any point during the past few days?" The question she had been dreading, because she knew that any answer she gave would sound calculating and selfish, even though it was rooted in desperation and fear. "Because I was afraid," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid. You would turn me away. Afraid I would have nowhere to go with 2 babies depending on me. Afraid that if I told the truth, I would lose the only chance I had for a safe home." James was quiet for so long that Emma began to wonder if he had heard her. When he finally responded, his words were measured and thoughtful, but she could hear the disappointment beneath them. "So you decided to deceive me instead, to let me believe I was getting a widow seeking a fresh start, when what I was actually getting was a woman with 2 infants who saw my advertisement as a solution to her problems." The summary was harsh but accurate, and Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes. "It wasn't like that," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "Wasn't it?" James asked quietly, "because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like that." Lucy chose that moment to cry, a weak, feverish sound that pierced through the tension in the room. Emma immediately focused on comforting her daughter, but she was aware of James watching her with new attention, taking in the practiced way she handled the baby, the obvious bond between mother and child. "She's sick," James observed, his voice losing some of its hard edge. "Just a fever," Emma said quickly. "I've been treating it, but it's not getting better." James stepped closer, studying Lucy's flushed face with concern that seemed to override his anger. "Dr. Hayes should look at her. Fevers in babies can turn serious quickly at this altitude." The suggestion was practical and caring, but it also highlighted another layer of Emma's impossible situation. "I can't take her to a doctor," she said. "The whole town would know, would ask questions." "The whole town is going to know anyway," James pointed out. "You can't hide two babies indefinitely, especially not in a community this size. And if you're more concerned about gossip than about your daughter's health, then maybe I don't know you at all." The rebuke stung because it contained enough truth to cut deep. Emma looked down at Lucy's feverish face and felt the weight of all her choices, all her fears, all her desperate calculations crashing down around her. "You're right," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't know me, and I don't know you. And I've made a terrible mistake that's hurt everyone involved." James studied her for a long moment, and Emma prepared herself for the words that would send her away, that would force her back into the uncertain world with two infants and no prospects. Instead, he surprised her. "Get Lucy ready to travel," he said quietly. "I'll hitch the wagon. We're taking her to see Dr. Hayes." Emma stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. But the questions, the gossip— "Let me worry about that," James said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Right now, your daughter needs medical attention, and that's more important than whatever social complications might arise." As he turned to leave, Emma called after him, "James, I know you have every right to send us away after this. I know I've betrayed your trust and put you in an impossible situation, but please, whatever you decide about me, don't let it affect getting help for Lucy." James paused in the doorway, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was tired but resolute. "Emma, I may be angry about how you've handled this, and I may not understand why you felt the need to lie to me for days on end, but I'm not the kind of man who would let a baby suffer because of adult complications. Whatever else happens between us, your children will be cared for." The promise should have brought Emma relief, but instead it highlighted the magnitude of what she had lost through her deception. James Mitchell was exactly the kind of man who would have welcomed her children, who would have seen them as part of the family he dreamed of building. Instead, through her fear and dishonesty, she had turned what could have been a joyful revelation into a betrayal that might have damaged their relationship beyond repair. As she prepared Lucy for the journey to town, Emma realized that her carefully constructed plan had crumbled completely. There would be no gradual revelation, no gentle introduction of the truth. Instead, she was about to arrive in Millbrook Valley with two babies and a story that would make her the subject of every conversation and speculation. But watching James efficiently prepare the wagon, seeing his focus on Lucy's welfare despite his own hurt and confusion, Emma began to understand that she had underestimated him from the beginning. The man she had been afraid to trust with the truth was proving himself worthy of that trust through his actions, even as he dealt with the consequences of her deception. The ride to town would be the beginning of everything changing, and Emma knew that by the time they returned to the ranch, nothing would ever be the same between them again. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the muddy main street as James guided the horses toward Dr. Hayes' office. Lucy bundled against Emma's chest, while Sam remained hidden back at the ranch under a pile of blankets. Every person they passed stopped their daily activities to stare, and Emma could practically feel the whispered conversations that would follow in their wake. The sight of James Mitchell's mail-order bride carrying an infant was exactly the kind of scandal that would fuel speculation for months. Dr. William Hayes was a thin man in his 60s whose gentle manner had earned him the trust of the entire valley, even among families who could barely afford his services. His office occupied the ground floor of a two-story building next to the general store, and Emma could see several faces pressed against windows as James helped her down from the wagon. Inside the doctor's office, Hayes examined Lucy with thorough competence, while Emma answered his questions about the baby's symptoms and medical history. James stood near the window, his attention divided between watching for Lucy's reactions and observing the growing crowd of curious onlookers gathering outside. "She has a respiratory infection, common enough at this altitude for newcomers," Dr. Hayes announced after his examination. "Nothing serious if treated properly, but it could have become dangerous if left untreated." He prepared a bottle of medicine and handed it to Emma along with detailed instructions. "Bring her back in 3 days so I can check her progress." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes touched James's arm gently. "I hope you know what you're doing, son. This valley doesn't take kindly to surprises, especially ones that challenge people's expectations about proper behavior." James nodded grimly. "I'm beginning to understand that, Doc, but some things are more important than keeping the peace." The ride back to the ranch passed in tense silence, both Emma and James acutely aware that their brief visit to town had fundamentally altered their situation. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending that Emma was simply a widow seeking a fresh start. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Millbrook Valley would know that James Mitchell's mail-order bride had arrived with a secret baby, and the speculation about what that meant would spread like wildfire through drought-dried grass. Back at the ranch, Emma tended to Lucy while James disappeared into his study, presumably to think through the implications of what had just occurred. The medicine Dr. Hayes had provided began working quickly, and by evening, Lucy's fever had broken and her breathing had returned to normal. But the relief Emma felt over her daughter's recovery was overshadowed by the certainty that much larger problems were gathering on the horizon. That night, James asked Emma to join him in the main room after the evening meal. He had built up the fire against the growing chill, and the flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he settled into his usual chair. Emma chose a seat across from him, Lucy sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Sam dozed in a basket at her feet. "We need to talk," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "About what happens now." Emma had been dreading this conversation since the moment he had discovered the twins, but she knew it was inevitable. "I understand if you want us to leave," she said quietly. "I know I've put you in an impossible position, and I have no right to expect you to deal with the consequences of my deception." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you think this is about? Me being inconvenienced by your situation?" "Isn't it?" Emma asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "You arranged for a wife, not a ready-made family with complications that could damage your standing in the community." "Emma," James said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm not angry because you have children. I'm angry because you didn't trust me enough to tell me about them. Do you understand the difference?" The distinction hit Emma like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the assumptions that had driven her deception. She had been so focused on protecting herself from rejection that she had never considered the possibility that James might have welcomed the truth, that his character might have been strong enough to embrace the complete picture of who she was. "I was afraid," she said simply. "Afraid that if I told you about the twins in my letters, you would never have agreed to marry me. Afraid that if I told you when I arrived, you would send me away immediately. I convinced myself that if I could just get you to know me first, maybe you would be willing to accept them as part of the arrangement." James was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if the flames might provide answers to questions he was still learning to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of disappointment that cut through Emma more effectively than anger would have. "What you're describing isn't marriage, Emma. It's a business transaction where you withheld important information from one of the parties. How was I supposed to make informed decisions about my future when I didn't even know what I was agreeing to?" The accuracy of his assessment stung because Emma could not argue with it. She had approached their arrangement as a negotiation where honesty was a luxury she could not afford, rather than as the foundation of a potential partnership. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I handled this all wrong from the beginning. I let my fear make decisions that should have been made by my conscience." James nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "The problem is, Emma, that now I don't know what else you might be hiding from me. How can I trust that this is the complete truth when you've already proven you're willing to maintain elaborate deceptions when it serves your purposes?" The question hung between them like a chasm Emma was not sure she could bridge. She had damaged something fundamental through her choices, and she was beginning to understand that the consequences extended far beyond social embarrassment or practical complications. "I'm not hiding anything else," she said, knowing even as. She spoke that the words probably carried little weight given her track record. "James, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness or your understanding, but I need you to know that everything I did was motivated by desperation, not by any desire to manipulate or deceive you for personal gain." Desperation, James repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me about that, Emma. Help me understand what brought you to the point where deception seemed like your only option." Emma took a shaky breath, realizing that this was her chance to offer the complete honesty she should have provided from the beginning. "When my husband died, his employer offered no compensation to his widow. The boarding house where we lived gave me 2 weeks to find other arrangements or face eviction. I had no family willing to help, no friends in a position to offer support, and no job skills that would allow me to earn enough to support myself and 2 infants. She paused, gathering courage to continue. "I answered 7 different mail order bride advertisements before yours. 4 never responded at all. 2 responded, but withdrew their offers when I mentioned that I was pregnant. 1 offered to marry me only if I agreed to give the babies up for adoption first." James's expression shifted slightly, surprise and perhaps understanding beginning to temper his disappointment. "And my advertisement?" "Your advertisement was different," Emma said. "You wrote about wanting companionship and partnership, about building something meaningful together. You sounded like someone who might value honesty and kindness over rigid social expectations. That's why I was so afraid to tell you the truth, because you seemed like exactly the kind of man who deserved better than the desperate lies I felt I had to tell." The irony of her logic was not lost on either of them, and James shook his head slowly. "So because you thought I was a good man, you decided to deceive me?" "Because I thought you were a good man, I hoped that maybe, eventually, you might be able to forgive the deception if it meant providing a home for 2 children who needed one," Emma corrected. "I know it was wrong, James. I knew it was wrong even when I was doing it. But I couldn't see any other path that didn't end with my children and me homeless and destitute." James stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the star-filled sky, while Emma waited in tense silence. When he finally turned back to her, his expression was complex, containing layers of emotion she could not fully read. "What you're describing," he said slowly, "is a woman who made difficult choices in an impossible situation. That's very different from a woman who habitually deceives people for personal advantage. But Emma, the result is the same. I don't know how to trust you now, and trust is the only foundation on which a real marriage can be built." Emma felt tears threatening, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "What are you saying, James?" "I'm saying that I need time to think, and you need to decide what you really want from this arrangement," James replied. "If you're looking for security and protection for your children, I can provide that without us pretending this is a love match. If you're looking for a real partnership, a genuine marriage, then we need to find a way to rebuild what your deception damaged." The offer was more generous than Emma had any right to expect. but it also highlighted the magnitude of what she had lost through her choices. James was willing to provide safety and security, but the possibility of real love, real partnership, had been wounded by her deception in ways that might never fully heal. Before Emma could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night air. James moved immediately to the window, his body language shifting to alert attention as he counted the riders approaching the ranch house. 5 men, he said grimly, and they're not here for a social visit. Emma joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead rider. Robert Sterling, the banker Margaret Sterling had mentioned, sat astride a large bay horse, with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his opinions treated as law. Behind him rode 4 other men Emma did not recognize, but their posture and the weapons visible on their saddles suggested they were not ordinary townspeople. "Stay inside with the children," James said, reaching for the rifle that hung above. "The fireplace. No matter what happens, don't come outside unless I call for you specifically." The riders dismounted in front of the house with deliberate ceremony, their movements coordinated and threatening. Robert Sterling stepped onto the porch without invitation, his fist pounding against the door with authority that brooked no refusal. James opened the door with his rifle visible but not raised, his stance communicating readiness without immediate aggression. "Sterling, what brings you to my ranch at this hour?" "I think you know exactly what brings us here, Mitchell," Sterling replied, his voice carrying across the yard loud enough for his companions to hear every word. "The whole town is talking about your mail-order bride and her secret bastard. We've come to discuss how this situation is going to be resolved." Emma felt ice form in her stomach at the man's crude language and threatening tone. Through the window, she could see the other riders positioning themselves strategically around the yard, cutting off potential escape routes and establishing tactical advantage. "What situation?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A woman seeking medical attention for her sick child? A woman who arrived under false pretenses and is now living in sin under your roof," Sterling shot back. "A woman who has made you the subject of gossip and speculation that reflects poorly on this entire community." James stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. "I'm not sure I understand your concern, Sterling. My personal arrangements are not subject to community approval." "They are when they affect the moral character of our town," Sterling replied. "We have standards here, Mitchell, standards that protect decent families from corruption and bad influences. Your woman has violated those standards, and something needs to be done about it." Emma could hear the conversation clearly from inside the house, and each word felt like a physical blow. She had known that her deception would create problems, but she had not anticipated the organized hostility that was now focused on James simply because he had shown her kindness. "What exactly are you proposing?" James asked, and Emma could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "Simple," Sterling replied. "The woman leaves town. Tonight, she can take her bastard with her, and you can find yourself a proper wife who won't bring shame to your family." "A name." The crude dismissal of Lucy as a bastard sent fury shooting through Emma's veins, but James's response was swift and decisive. "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "Emma and her children are under my protection, and they're not going anywhere unless they choose to leave." Sterling's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Protection? Mitchell, you can't even hear a man approaching your ranch. What kind of protection do you think you can provide against people who don't appreciate harboring immoral women?" The attack on James's deafness was clearly calculated to provoke a response, and Emma could see the tension in his shoulders as he processed the insult. But his reply remained controlled, though the danger in his voice was unmistakable. "My hearing has never prevented me from handling threats to my property or my family. If you'd like to test that theory, you're welcome to try." "Family?" Sterling scoffed. "You've known this woman for 3 days, and she's been lying to you the entire time. What kind of family is built on deception and illegitimate children?" Emma could not remain silent any longer. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch beside James, Lucy still in her arms and her chin raised in defiance, despite the terror racing through her veins. "My children are not illegitimate," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard to ensure all the riders could hear her. "They were born to married parents, and their father died serving his country in a factory that supported the war effort. If you have problems with me, Mr. Sterling, then address them to me directly instead of hiding behind insults to innocent babies." Sterling's eyes narrowed as he studied Emma, taking in her defensive posture and the protective way she held her child. "Married parents," he repeated mockingly. "Then where's your wedding ring, Mrs. Harrison? Where's the marriage certificate? That proves these children aren't the bastards everyone knows them to be." Emma's heart sank as she realized the vulnerability Sterling had identified. In her desperation to leave Chicago, she had sold her wedding ring to pay for train fare, and her marriage certificate was buried somewhere in her few remaining possessions. She had no immediate way to prove the legitimacy of her children's birth, and in a community already predisposed to suspicion, the absence of proof would be taken as confirmation of guilt. James stepped slightly in front of Emma, his rifle now held in a position that suggested immediate use was possible. "Sterling, you and your men need to leave my property. Now, whatever grievances you have with Emma can be addressed through proper legal channels, not through late-night intimidation." "Legal channels," Sterling repeated, his smile cold and calculating. "That's an interesting suggestion, Mitchell, because legally speaking, harboring an unmarried woman with illegitimate children could be considered contributing to moral corruption. The territorial governor has been very clear about his expectations for frontier communities to maintain proper standards." Oh, the threat was clearly rehearsed and designed to exploit James's vulnerable position as someone whose disability might make him seem like an easy target for legal manipulation. But James's response demonstrated that Sterling had seriously underestimated his opponent. "The territorial governor," James said slowly, "is my second cousin, and he appointed me to the Territorial Cattle Commission specifically because he trusts my judgment about character and moral standards. Would you like me to send him a telegram describing your late-night visit to threaten a widow and her sick infant?" Sterling's confident expression wavered slightly as he processed this unexpected information. Emma felt a surge of hope as she realized that James's connections extended far beyond Millbrook Valley, that his influence might provide protection she had not anticipated. But Sterling recovered quickly, his expression hardening with renewed determination. "Family connections won't protect you from the consequences of poor judgment, Mitchell. This community won't tolerate moral corruption, regardless of who you're related to in the territorial capital." "Then perhaps this community needs to examine its own moral standards," James replied. "Because from where I stand, a group of armed men threatening a woman and her children in the middle of the night represents a far greater moral failing than anything Emma has done." Indeed, the standoff stretched taut between them. 5 armed men facing one deaf rancher and a woman holding a baby, with the future of Emma's family hanging in the balance. Sterling's hand moved closer to his gun, and Emma realized that the situation was escalating toward violence that could destroy everything James had built. "James," she said quietly, touching his arm. "Maybe they're right. Maybe it would be better if I left before this causes more problems for you." James turned to look at her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. When he spoke, His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and it carried a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Emma, when I asked you to marry me, I made a commitment that doesn't disappear just because other people disapprove of my choices. These men can threaten and intimidate all they want, but they cannot force me to abandon someone who has placed their trust in my protection." The declaration hung in the night air like a thrown gauntlet, and Emma realized that James had just publicly committed to defending her regardless of the personal cost. He was choosing her and her children over the easy path of social acceptance, and the magnitude of his decision left her speechless. Sterling's face darkened with rage at James's defiance. "You're making a mistake, Mitchell. A mistake that's going to cost you more than you can afford to lose." "That's my decision to make," James replied calmly, "just as leaving my property immediately is yours." For a moment, Emma thought Sterling might escalate the confrontation to actual violence. His hand hovered near his weapon, and she could see the calculations running through his mind as he weighed the risks and benefits of forcing the issue. But something in James's steady gaze, or perhaps the growing awareness that threatening a territorial cattle commissioner might have serious consequences, caused Sterling to step back from the brink. "This isn't over, Mitchell," he said, mounting his horse with aggressive efficiency. "Not by a long shot. You've chosen your side, and now you'll live with the consequences." As the riders departed, their horses' hooves echoing across the valley like distant thunder, Emma felt the weight of what had just occurred settling over her like a heavy blanket. James had publicly committed to protecting her and her children, but in doing so, he had made enemies of powerful people who could make his life extremely difficult. "James," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Not tonight, Emma," he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Tonight has been complicated enough. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to deal with the mess we're both responsible for creating." As they returned to the house, Emma realized that the confrontation with Sterling had fundamentally changed the dynamic between her and James. They were no longer two people trying to negotiate the terms of a convenient arrangement. They were now allies, bound together by external threats and mutual dependence, facing a community that had declared them unwelcome. The question that remained was whether their alliance could grow into something deeper, something that could survive the challenges that were undoubtedly coming their way. Emma looked at James as he secured the house for the night, noting the determined set of his shoulders and the careful way he checked each window and door. He had chosen to fight for her and her children, even though she had given him every reason to doubt her character. Now it was her turn to decide whether she was worthy of the faith he had shown in her, and whether she was brave enough to fight for the family they might be able to build together. Dawn brought no relief from the tensions of the previous night. Emma woke to the sound of hammering and looked out her window to see James reinforcing the barn doors with additional crossbeams. The message was clear. Sterling's threats had been taken seriously, and preparations were being made for more substantial confrontations. At breakfast, James's ranch hands gathered around the kitchen table with an air of grim determination that hadn't been present during Emma's first days at the ranch. Miguel, the head wrangler, spread a hand-drawn map of the property across the worn wood surface, while Ben and Tom studied the approaches to the main house with tactical precision. "They'll come at night again," Miguel said, his accented English careful and deliberate. "Sterling, he thinks darkness makes men brave, but we know this land better than any of them." James nodded, his attention focused on the map, while Emma fed Lucy near the window. "What about the cattle? If they're planning to make this personal, the herd would be an easy target." "Already moving them to the high pasture," Tom replied, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Ben's taking 3 men up there to keep watch. Harder to stampede cattle when they're scattered across mountain meadows." Emma listened to the conversation with growing unease. realizing that James's decision to protect her and the twins was affecting every aspect of ranch operations. Men were being diverted from their regular work to prepare for conflict, cattle were being moved to less convenient locations, and the entire operation was being reorganized around the threat posed by her presence. "James," she said quietly, waiting until the other men had left to tend their duties. "This is too much. You're putting your entire livelihood at risk because of my problems." James looked up from the map, his expression serious but resolute. "Emma, what's happening here isn't about your problems anymore. It's about what kind of community Millbrook Valley is going to be, and whether men like Sterling get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." The philosophical framework he was placing around their situation was noble, but Emma knew the practical reality was more complicated. That's a beautiful sentiment, but it doesn't change the fact that your cattle operation is being disrupted. Your men are being put in danger, and your standing in the community is being destroyed because I was too cowardly to tell you the truth from the beginning. James studied her for a long moment, then set down the pencil he had been using to mark defensive positions on the map. "Emma, do you know why I decided to advertise for a mail-order bride instead of courting someone locally?" The question seemed unrelated to their current crisis, but Emma shook her head, curious about his reasoning. "Because every woman in this valley has known me since I was a boy," James explained. "They remember the accident that took my hearing. They remember how I struggled in school. They remember every mistake I made learning to manage this ranch. When they look at me, they see someone to be pitied or protected, not someone to be respected as an equal partner." Emma began to understand where his explanation was leading, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to work through his thoughts completely. "You came here knowing nothing about my history, nothing about my limitations, nothing about what other people thought I could or couldn't accomplish. For the first time in my adult life, I was interacting with someone who saw me as I am now, not as the damaged boy I used to be." The revelation hit Emma with unexpected force, making her realize that James's decision to defend her was about more than simple chivalry or moral principle. It was about defending his right to make his own choices about his life and his future, free from the constraints of other people's expectations and prejudices. "But I did deceive you," Emma pointed out. "I'm not the honest woman you thought you were getting." "No," James agreed. "But you're also not the helpless victim Sterling wants to paint you as. You're a woman who made difficult choices in desperate circumstances, and you're strong enough to face the consequences of those choices. That's exactly the kind of partner I was hoping to find." Before Emma could respond to this unexpected declaration, the sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. But this time, instead of Sterling's threatening delegation, a single horse approached the ranch house at a measured pace that suggested official business rather than confrontation. Through the window, Emma could see a man in his 50s dismounting from a well-groomed mare, his clothes marking him as someone of considerable authority and means. James recognized him immediately and moved toward the door with an expression of cautious optimism. "Judge Morrison," James said, opening the door before the man could knock. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Judge Morrison was a tall man whose bearing suggested years of making difficult decisions with careful deliberation. His eyes were kind but shrewd, taking in Emma and the babies with professional assessment rather than social judgment. "James, I rode out from the county seat as soon as I received Sterling's telegram. He's made some serious accusations about the moral character of your household, and I felt it was important to investigate the situation personally before taking any official action." Emma felt her stomach drop as she realized that Sterling had escalated his campaign beyond local intimidation to involve territorial legal authorities. If Judge Morrison decided that her presence at the ranch violated community standards, he had the power to enforce Sterling's demands through legal channels. "I see," James said calmly. "And what exactly has Sterling accused us of?" Judge Morrison consulted a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Harboring an unmarried woman with illegitimate children, contributing to moral corruption, violating community decency standards, and endangering the welfare of minors through inappropriate living arrangements." The formal language made Emma's situation sound sordid and criminal, even though she knew that every charge was based on assumptions and incomplete information. But she also knew that in frontier communities, perception often mattered more than truth, and Sterling had clearly crafted his accusations to exploit existing prejudices about women who didn't conform to rigid social expectations. "Those are serious charges," James acknowledged. "I assume you'd like to hear our side of the story before reaching any conclusions." Judge Morrison nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here, James. Sterling's version of events is quite damning, but I've known you long enough to suspect there might be more to the situation than he's presenting." Over the next hour, Emma found herself recounting her entire story to Judge Morrison, from her husband's death to her desperate decision to answer James's advertisement, to her choice to conceal the twins during her journey and first days at the ranch. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never expressing judgment about the choices she had made. When she finished, Judge Morrison turned his attention to James. "And your position on all of this?" "Emma made mistakes," James said simply. "She should have told me about the children from the beginning, but her mistakes were born of desperation and fear, not of any desire to harm or deceive for personal gain. I've chosen to forgive those mistakes and to provide her and her children with the protection and security they need." Judge Morrison studied both of them for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Harrison, do you have any documentation that proves your marriage to the children's father?" Emma's heart sank. "I sold my wedding ring to pay for train fare, and my marriage certificate is somewhere in my belongings, but I'm not sure I can locate it quickly." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "That's unfortunate, but not necessarily fatal to your case. Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned that you and Mrs. Harrison were married by correspondence. Do you have the paperwork documenting that ceremony?" Emma and James exchanged glances, realizing they had never actually completed the legal formalities that would make their mail order arrangement official. In the chaos of the twins' discovery and the community's hostile reaction, the actual marriage ceremony had been postponed indefinitely. "We haven't actually been married yet," James admitted. "The legal ceremony was planned for this week, but circumstances have interfered with those arrangements." Judge Morrison's expression grew more serious. "I see. So Mrs. Harrison is currently living in your household as an unmarried woman with 2 children, which technically supports Sterling's accusations about improper living arrangements." Emma felt the walls closing in around her as she realized how precarious her legal position truly was. Without marriage to James or proof of her previous marriage, she was exactly what Sterling had accused her of being: an unmarried woman with children of questionable legitimacy, living in circumstances that violated community moral standards. However, Judge Morrison continued, the law also recognizes that emergency circumstances can create situations that require flexibility in applying social conventions. Mrs. Harrison, would you be willing to marry Mr. Mitchell immediately, with me performing the ceremony in order to regularize your living situation? The proposal was practical and would solve most of their legal problems, but Emma knew it would also force James into a marriage he might not truly want, driven by external pressure rather than mutual choice and affection. "Judge Morrison," Emma said carefully. "I appreciate your offer, but I don't want James to feel pressured into marriage as a solution to legal problems. He deserves the right to choose his wife freely, not because circumstances have backed him into a corner." Judge Morrison smiled for the first time since his arrival. "Mrs. Harrison, that's a remarkably mature and selfless position. But I think you should let Mr. Mitchell speak for himself about what he wants." James had been listening to the conversation with growing intensity, and when he finally spoke, his words carried a conviction that surprised Emma with its strength. "Emma, I asked you to marry me because I believed we could build a good life together. Nothing that's happened since you arrived has changed that belief. If anything, seeing how you've handled this crisis has convinced me that you're exactly the kind of partner I want. The timing isn't ideal, but the substance is exactly what I hoped for." Emma stared at him, trying to process the sincerity in his voice and the possibility that he might actually want this marriage despite everything that had happened. "James, are you sure? Because once we're married, there's no going back if you decide you made a mistake." "I'm sure," James said firmly. "Emma, I want to marry you. I want to be a father to Lucy and Sam. I want us to build the family we both need, and I want to do it right here on this ranch, regardless of what Sterling or anyone else thinks about our choices." Judge Morrison cleared his throat gently. "Well, then, if you're both in agreement, I suggest we proceed with the ceremony immediately. It will eliminate most of Sterling's legal objections and provide you with the protection of established marriage laws." D. The wedding ceremony that followed was nothing like what Emma had imagined during her girlhood dreams of marriage. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration feast with family and friends. Instead, there was Judge Morrison's formal recitation of vows, James's steady responses, and Emma's trembling voice promising to love and honor a man she was still learning to know. But there was also something profoundly meaningful about the simplicity of the moment. Standing in James's kitchen with Lucy in her arms, and Sam sleeping in his basket nearby, Emma felt the rightness of what they were doing, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them to this point. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, James leaned down to kiss Emma gently, a promise of affection that felt genuine despite the practical motivations for their union. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook Valley, Emma felt a sense of belonging that went beyond mere shelter and security. After Judge Morrison departed with official documentation of their marriage, Emma found herself in the strange position of being a legitimate wife and mother whose problems were far from solved. Sterling's moral objections had been legally neutralized, but his hostility remained unchanged, and she knew their troubles were far from over. That afternoon, as if to confirm her fears, Miguel rode in from the high pasture with disturbing news. "Someone's been cutting fence lines," he reported to James. "Professional job, not random vandalism, and there are signs that strangers have been scouting the cattle herd." James received this information with grim acceptance, as if he had been expecting exactly this kind of escalation. "How many head could we lose if they stampede the herd?" "All of them," Miguel replied bluntly. "If they hit us at night with enough men, they could scatter cattle from here to Denver. Take us months to round them up, if we ever found them all." Emma felt sick as she realized the magnitude of what Sterling was apparently planning. Destroying James's cattle herd would ruin him financially, forcing him to sell the ranch and leave the valley. It was a form of economic warfare designed to punish him for defying community pressure. "There's something else," Miguel continued reluctantly. "Tom heard talk in town about organizing a citizens committee to address moral corruption. Sterling's been recruiting men from outside the valley, promising them work if they help clean up what he calls undesirable elements." The implications were clear. Sterling was assembling a force large enough to overwhelm the ranch's defenses, using the pretense of moral righteousness to justify what amounted to vigilante action against anyone who opposed his vision of proper community standards. That evening, as Emma helped James review their defensive preparations, she found herself struggling with the scope of what her presence had unleashed. "James, I had no idea that answering your advertisement would create this kind of danger for you and your men." James looked up from the list of weapons and ammunition they had available. "Emma, what's happening here would have happened eventually, regardless of your arrival. Sterling has been looking for an opportunity to establish himself as the moral authority in this valley for years. Your situation just gave him the excuse he was waiting for. But without me and the twins, you wouldn't be facing the loss of your ranch and everything you've worked for," Emma pointed out. "Without you and the twins," James corrected, "I'd still be a lonely man running a successful cattle operation with no real purpose beyond making money. Now, I have a family worth fighting for and principles worth defending. That's not a trade I regret making." The conviction in his voice was absolute, but Emma could see the worry in his eyes as he contemplated the challenges ahead. Sterling had resources and community support that would be difficult to overcome, and James was risking everything he had built on the belief that right would ultimately triumph over might. As night fell over the ranch, Emma tucked the twins into their makeshift nursery, while James made final preparations for what everyone expected would be Sterling's major assault on their position. The house had been fortified as much as possible. The cattle had been moved to more defensible positions, and the ranch hands had been armed and positioned to provide maximum protection for the family. But Emma knew that all their preparations might not be enough if Sterling came with enough men and sufficient determination. The legal protection provided by their marriage was meaningless if their opponents were willing to ignore law in favor of their own version of justice. Standing at her bedroom window, Emma could see lights moving in the distance, suggesting that Sterling's forces were indeed gathering for some kind of coordinated action. The sight filled her with a mixture of fear and determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had come to Colorado as a desperate woman seeking safety for her children. Now she was a wife and mother prepared to fight for the family and home she had found against anyone who threatened to take them away. The transformation felt complete and irreversible, binding her to James and to this place with ties that went far deeper than legal documents or practical arrangements. Tomorrow would bring the test of whether their hastily assembled family could survive the forces arrayed against them. But tonight, for the first time since her husband's death, Emma felt she belonged somewhere worth defending. The attack came just before midnight, announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifle fire aimed at the sky rather than targets. Sterling had brought more men than James had anticipated, at least 15 riders who spread across the ranch property with tactical precision that suggested military experience among their ranks. Emma crouched in the reinforced bedroom with both twins, her heart hammering as gunshots echoed through the valley. Through the heavy shutters, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies, and she could hear James's voice calling commands to his men from somewhere near the barn. The initial assault was designed to create chaos, rather than inflict casualties, with Sterling's forces firing into the air and shouting threats while positioning themselves to control all approaches to the main house. Emma realized they were not trying to kill anyone yet, but rather to demonstrate their overwhelming numbers and force a surrender through intimidation. From her hiding place, Emma could hear Sterling's voice booming across the yard. "Mitchell, you've got one chance to end this peacefully. Send the woman and her bastards out, and we'll let you keep your ranch. Otherwise, we'll burn everything you've built and drive you out of this valley permanently." James's response came from the direction of the barn, calm and unwavering despite the circumstances. "Sterling, you're trespassing on private property, with armed men threatening a legally married woman and her legitimate children. Leave now, and I won't press charges with the territorial authorities." Sterling's harsh laughter cut through the night air. "Legally married? That sham ceremony doesn't change what she is or what those children represent. This valley won't tolerate moral corruption, regardless of what papers you wave around." What followed was a tense standoff that stretched across several hours, with Sterling's men maintaining their positions while James and his ranch hands held defensive points around the property. Neither side was willing to escalate to actual violence, but the threat hung heavy in the air like smoke from a distant fire. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Emma heard a new sound that made her heart leap with hope. More riders were approaching, but these came from the direction of town rather than from Sterling's assembled forces. Through a crack in the shutters, she could see Judge Morrison leading a group of at least 20 men toward the ranch house, all of them armed and moving with the authority of official law enforcement. Sterling's confident voice wavered as he recognized the judge. "Morrison, this is community business. These people have violated moral standards that decent folks won't tolerate." Judge Morrison's response carried the weight of territorial law behind it. "Sterling, you and your men are engaged in armed trespass, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy to commit destruction of private property. You have 30 seconds to disperse, or I'll place all of you under arrest for disturbing the peace." The transformation in the situation was immediate and decisive. Sterling's hired men began looking nervously at each other, clearly unwilling to face legal consequences for what they had assumed would be a simple intimidation tactic. Several of them mounted their horses and rode away without waiting for Sterling's permission, leaving him with insufficient numbers to maintain his threatening position. Sterling himself seemed stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune, his face cycling through anger, disbelief, and calculation as he processed the collapse of his carefully planned assault. "This isn't over, Morrison. These people represent everything. That's wrong with frontier communities, and decent folks won't forget that you protected them." Judge Morrison's reply was measured but firm. "Sterling, decent folks don't organize armed attacks on families with newborn babies. If you want to challenge the moral character of this community, I suggest you start by examining your own behavior." As Sterling and his remaining supporters retreated, Emma finally allowed herself to believe that the immediate danger had passed. She emerged from her hiding place to find James waiting for her in the main room, his face showing the strain of the long night, but his eyes bright with relief and something that looked remarkably like pride. "It's over," he said simply, opening his arms to embrace her and the twins. "Sterling won't be bothering us again, not with Judge Morrison making it clear that territorial law protects our right to live as we choose." Emma melted into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of his body and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt completely safe, protected not just by James's physical presence, but by his unwavering commitment to their family and their future together. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into a new rhythm that reflected their changed circumstances. James threw himself into rebuilding what Sterling's harassment had disrupted, working alongside his men to repair damaged fences and restore normal cattle operations. Emma found herself taking on the role of ranch wife, with growing confidence, managing household affairs while caring for the twins and learning the dozens of skills required for frontier life. The community's reaction to their triumph over Sterling was mixed but gradually shifting in their favor. Judge Morrison's intervention had demonstrated that Emma and James had powerful legal protection, and the obviously loving way James interacted with the twins made it difficult for anyone to maintain that their family arrangement was somehow harmful or immoral. Martha Cooper, the general store owner's wife, became Emma's first genuine friend in Millbrook Valley, offering practical advice about frontier motherhood and serving as a bridge to other women who were curious about the newcomer but had been afraid to approach her during the conflict with Sterling. Dr. Hayes continued to monitor the twins' health and development, pronouncing them thriving despite the upheaval of their first weeks in Colorado. His professional approval carried weight in the community, gradually eroding the assumption that Emma was somehow an unfit mother because of her unconventional arrival. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Emma found James sitting on the front porch with Lucy sleeping in his arms while Sam dozed in a basket at his feet. The sight of this strong, capable man tenderly cradling her daughter filled Emma's heart with emotions she was finally ready to acknowledge. "James," she said, settling beside him on the wooden bench he had built for watching the sunset. "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago." He looked at her with the patient attention that had become one of his most endearing qualities, waiting for her to find the words she needed. "I love you," Emma said simply, "not because you've provided security for me and the children, and not because you've protected us from Sterling and his threats. I love you because of who you are, because of the kind of man who would choose kindness over safety, who would see potential in a desperate woman with secrets, who would become a father to children who weren't his own, without expecting anything in return." James's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face with warmth that made Emma's heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. "Emma, I've been waiting to hear you say that, not because I needed the words, but because I wanted to be sure you understood what we've built together." He shifted Lucy carefully to one arm and reached for Emma's hand with the other. "I love you too, not despite the complications you brought into my life, but because of the way you faced those complications with courage and integrity. You've made me a better man, and you've given me the family I always dreamed of having." The kiss they shared was different from the formal peck that had sealed their wedding ceremony weeks earlier. This was a promise of genuine affection, a declaration of partnership that went far deeper than legal documents or practical arrangements. As winter settled over the valley, Emma reflected on the transformation that had occurred since her arrival. On that cold spring day, with her hidden secrets and desperate hopes. She had come to Colorado as a deceptive woman seeking shelter, but she had become a wife, a mother, and a valued member of a community that had initially rejected her. The twins thrived in the clean mountain air, growing stronger and more alert. With each passing day, Lucy's fever had been the last serious health concern, and both children seemed to flourish under James's devoted attention. He had embraced fatherhood with the same competence and dedication he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and warm bottles with the efficiency of someone who approached new challenges as opportunities for growth. The ranch prospered as well, with cattle prices rising and James's reputation as a skilled rancher spreading throughout the territory. His deafness, once seen by some as a limitation, had become recognized as simply one characteristic of a man whose other qualities far outweighed any perceived disadvantages. On Christmas morning, as Emma watched James teaching Sam to grasp a wooden rattle he had carved himself while Lucy babbled happily from her high chair, she realized that her desperate gamble had led to something far more valuable than the security she had originally sought. She had found love, genuine and lasting, with a man who saw her truly and chose her completely. She had found a home where her children could grow up surrounded by acceptance and opportunity. Most importantly, she had found herself, discovering strength and resilience she had never known she possessed. The mail-order bride, who had arrived with hidden twins and a heart full of secrets, had become a woman capable of facing any challenge life might bring, secure in the knowledge that she was loved for exactly who she was, complications and all. As snow began to fall outside the ranch house windows, covering the valley in pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, Emma understood that sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most beautiful destinations. Her journey to Colorado had begun with deception and fear, but it had transformed into a story of redemption, love, and the endless possibility that comes from choosing courage over safety. The deaf cattle baron had indeed seen in her what the town couldn't, but more importantly, he had helped her see in herself what she had never recognized before. A woman worthy of love, capable of building a future as bright and limitless as the Colorado sky that stretched endlessly above their mountain home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.